Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. It has certainly been an eventful weekend. Were you able to tune out the news and get any rest at all, Niall?
I was trying my best. I had family members in town, so I was able to tune out on Saturday, and then, of course, events took over and it was more difficult to ignore them. Do you have a good weekend, Robby?
I did have a good weekend, but
Excellent.
I woke up this morning with a fire to discuss everything that is going on.
Well, let's get started with that then. What is on your radar?
Regime change. Those are the two words on everybody's mind following the U.S. military's successful strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. Operation Midnight Hammer has been deemed a rousing success, burying Fordo under rubble and apparently setting back Iran's nuclear program by months or years. We'll discuss that in a little bit. Many individuals in the MAGA coalition are, however, skeptical of President Donald Trump's decision to join Israel in attacking Iran, a decision that Trump apparently made after consulting Israeli intelligence and facing pressure from Israel's government to act. Trump, of course, ran for president as the peace candidate and promised no new wars in the Middle East. But he's also dead set against the idea of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, and so here we are. Initially after the strikes, Trump issued a statement.
That the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier. For 40 years, Iran has been saying death to America, death to Israel.
But on Truth Social, Trump wrote, "Now is the time for peace," and he urged the Iranian government to come to the negotiating table. Well, that's a good sentiment, although some people may wonder whether, having just been attacked, Iran has any interest in coming to the negotiating table. Do they want diplomacy, or are they more determined to fight than they were previously? Regardless, the America First contingent of the MAGA movement, which does not want to become involved in another war in the Middle East and thought that Trump was the guy to keep us out of it, could at least take comfort in the fact that the strikes were aimed at Iran's nuclear capabilities and were not about, apparently, overthrowing the Iranian regime. When asked on the Sunday shows whether we were now at war with Iran, Vice President J.D. Vance said, well, we were at war with Iran's nuclear program, not with the country itself. Of course, maybe he has to say that because the U.S. has not declared war on Iran, something that would take a vote by Congress. But then, just hours ago, Trump wrote something else on Truth Social. It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change? MAGA, I don't know how to say that. Look, if the people of Iran rise up in some glorious spirit of liberation and replace their Islamic theocratic rulers with a secular democracy, that would obviously be great. It just seems extremely unlikely to me that it will actually happen. Our previous regime change experiences in the region have gone horribly. There was Iraq, there was Libya, there was Syria, etc. U.S. foreign policy cannot revolve around regime change in the Middle East. It doesn't work. The American people don't want it. U.S. leaders who have agitated for it have exposed themselves as naive time and time again. Now, Donald Trump typically has excellent political instincts. I fully concede that. But in this one, he's not listening to the base, which wants America first. Trump should spend more time with Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rand Paul and Joe Rogan and everybody in the MAGA movement who put some degree of faith in Trump because he consistently opposed disastrous wars in the Middle East. Make Iran great again? I'm sorry, no, it's make America great again. And America will not be great if we are bogged down in another Middle East war. We did not vote to enact the political agenda of the late Senator John McCain. We voted to mind our own business and focus on domestic problems. I really thought Trump got that. Now I am not entirely sure, because he is in fact going farther, Niall, than some of what his advisors have said, that no, this is about taking out the nuclear capabilities, and now we want to negotiate. It's not about regime change. Trump is giving voice to the regime change crowd that has been part of a Republican establishment that he himself ran against and largely beat back into the shadows, into obscurity, and now seems to be once again directing our Middle East policy, our foreign policy, no matter who we vote for, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump and everything in between. We still get a foreign policy geared around regime change.
Yeah, he is opening the door to that very wide, having run as a candidate who was closed off from that sort of thing. You drew the contrast with John McCain, the late John McCain, who had a much more interventionist mindset. And I think that's why this has caused such consternation to the Steve Bannons and Tucker Carlsons. And, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I have criticised about 99 times out of 100 things that she's done, has actually stuck with her principles in this one and continues to say that she thinks it is wrong for the US to be essentially fighting a war at Israel's behest. And I think that is correct. In terms of regime change and this Truth Social post that Trump made, it just seems to me a basically ludicrous assumption that the Iranian people will be made more amenable to throwing off their rulers while the US and Israel are bombing them, changing them at the behest of Israel and the United States. If anything, that seems to me much more likely to make the Iranian people more to rally round the flag, even though they have many very well-founded objections to that theocratic regime.
Right, and what would that even look like? I get that. I know that Ali Khamenei is a very old man. He could, if we continue military intervention, it is fully possible we could kill him intentionally or inadvertently, and then he would be replaced because he would no longer be alive. He would no longer be the head of the government. That doesn't mean the government itself will change in character. It could just be another theocratic Islamic extremist. Mm-hmm. So the idea of it changing in a way favorable to us, you know, when you go through past examples of regime change that has more or less succeeded, we have to go back basically to World War II. We go, yes, we did regime change in Germany. We did regime change in Japan. That took occupying the countries with troops, destroying, in the case of Germany, destroying the entire country. In the case of Japan, not the entire country, but killing hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in not just the nuclear bombings, but the firebombing of Tokyo before that, and then occupying the country for a long period of time. Sure. That is what successful regime change, a regime change that was favorable to the United States' interests, that's what it took. It took an occupation. Is that what we're going to do? Right.
Well, and also in those cases, obviously in the case of Japan, it had attacked the United States. Yes. And in the case of Nazi Germany, it was an absolute horrific threat to democracy and freedom in the world. Right. I think there is easily an argument that could be made that Iran could have been contained and could continue to be contained. And this expansive sort of vision of regime change, I think, is crazy stuff. Just briefly, I noticed that some of the people pushing it, well, they're kind of giving me flashbacks to the Iraq War when there were guys like Ahmad Chalabi and all those guys around selling people in Washington on the idea that this was all going to be fantastic, would be welcomed as liberators. Did not work out that way.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this more during the show a lot, but for now I'll just say it's going to be, I know exactly how this is going to go. It's going to be tough for people on the right who say, I like Trump, but I disagree with him on this, or I think this is going a little bit further than I want it to go, and they're going to be called unpatriotic or traitors. You already see Thomas Massie facing some of that. I'm sure Rand Paul's going to get the same thing. I'm sure Marjorie Taylor Greene's going to get the same thing. But we know how this works. We know how it works with Iraq, is that in hindsight, those people, the American people, come to side more and more with, after the patriotic fervor of the hell yes, we bombed them, great, starts to die down, and we ask questions about what are we actually doing here? What did we accomplish? Was this good? With Iraq, it took a while. I mean, the public opinion caught up with it before our leadership did. But I would say to people like myself on the right who are skeptical at best and want more restraint, hold the line. We're not going to just fall in line. We're not going to do whatever Trump wants us to do in all circumstances. It is better to stand up for your principles. You will, in hindsight, feel better about yourself and be proven correct.
Always a good idea to stand up for your principles.
Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a show for you today that you will hopefully enjoy. Good morning, Niall.
Morning, Robby. How are you today?
I'm missing my laptop because it has a virus that apparently all the laptops in the Hills offices are getting, which is kind of ridiculous and reminds me of the 1990s.
I am virus resistant so far, but at any moment I could be taken
You updated your Norton.
I did not do any such thing. I've just miraculously avoided it so far. But despite your lack of laptop, you do have a radar for us, so let's have it. What's on your radar, Robby?
Indeed I do. Thomas Massie, being sassy, calling out the administration's approach to Iran, slamming the bombing campaign against Iran's nuclear capabilities as the new 2 weeks to slow the spread of 2025. Talk about viruses. It's a good line. Watch this.
My question is, does, 3 bombings and we're done with Iran's nuclear ambitions? Is that the 2 weeks to slow the spread of 2025? Is this, we were told 2 weeks to slow the spread then. Now we're told it's just going to take 3 bombings. But what happens when Israel gets bombed again? Is Trump going to sit by and say, no, we're not going to further engage in this war?
No surprise, I like that metaphor quite a bit. At the start of the pandemic, if you recall that, we were assured by the experts in government and healthcare we just needed to lock down and social distance for 2 weeks in order to give hospitals the time they need to prepare for handling COVID cases. A brief, minimal interruption, and then life would return to normal. But that was a lie. Government policymakers then extended the 2 weeks all summer. We were no longer trying to just slow the spread. We were trying to minimize cases until the vaccines were available. Well, and then until everyone had a vaccine, and then until some theoretical time in the future where there would be no more cases. Fortunately, the public had lost patience by then, and our government's preference for restrictions on our liberties was overruled. Guess what? Thomas Massie thinks it's happening again. Our government has assured us that this is just a limited number of strikes, not against the Iranian government itself, but against its nuclear capabilities. Vice President J.D. Vance confidently asserted that the U.S. is at war with Iran's nukes, not Iran. Well, that's a distinction that frankly doesn't make very much sense, but perhaps he feels he has to make it since Congress never voted to authorize a war against Iran. Another point Thomas Massie keeps making. Indeed, the Iraq War, by contrast, was debated, discussed, ultimately voted on, so that those who backed it could later be held accountable. That is what Massie thinks should happen this time, too. And for his sin, wanting Congress to do its job per the Constitution, President Trump is savaging him. Indeed, Trump has laid into Massie with such fury. Massie joked Trump should try to get a declaration of war for that as well. And look, it's not just idle chatter. Trump is also launching a primary challenge against Massie. Axios reported on Monday that Trump's team is starting a super PAC with the goal of getting Massie out of office. Trump political advisor Chris LaCivita said they would spend whatever it takes to defeat Massie. Well, that'll be quite a challenge for them, as Massie is extremely popular in his district and has previously shrugged off attempts by AIPAC and others to harm him. Now, Massie, I would argue, is popular because he is MAGA. He is America first. He has principles and doesn't just throw them away because Trump is suddenly singing the neocon song. Massie knows that America's regime change wars in the Middle East have been a disaster and that Americans are sick of them. We do not want to get bogged down in a conflict between Israel and Iran. And we know that our government often shifts the goalposts on us. 2 weeks to slow the spread becomes multi-year lockdowns, mask requirements, school closures, and eventual vaccine mandates. Similarly, a bombing campaign against nuclear capabilities could become that dirty two-word phrase we don't like to hear so much, regime change. And now the news, of course, this morning, Niall, is that we might have a ceasefire, tenuous deal in place. We will discuss that in greater detail in our next segment. But for now, I'm no surprise to you. I'm a fan of Thomas Massie.
Sure.
And I think it's funny that Trump is kind of raging against him and also Rand Paul a little bit. But Massie has faced challenges before from a more neoconservative hawkish from Israel, from AIPAC. And he shrugged those off, so I don't know if it'll be different this time.
No, I mean, I think for a start, his point or his argument that he makes and you endorses about the kind of slippery slope seems a very fair argument. Once you get involved in military action, then do you open the door for more military action for what Colin Powell used to call mission creep? So I think those things are problems or potential problems. Yes, we do have a ceasefire. We'll get into that, as you say, in a moment, but whether it will hold is certainly open to question. Then the fact of Trump trying to sort of intimidate Massie seems to me to be beyond Thomas Massie and sort of an attempt to impose an even greater level of loyalty to Trump across the board within the Republican Party. It's not as if there's any shortage of that loyalty in the first place. They, generally speaking, do his bidding. But to me, this is about sort of making an example of Massie, which Trump hopes will work to quell any dissent. But as you say, Massie may not, in fact, be very easily defeated in a primary. Because
I think, broadly speaking, there's two kinds of internal resistance to Trump within the Republican Party. There's like a personality-based resistance that now has been stamped out entirely, but was part of characteristic of the first Trump administration, where you still had, kind of never Trump people who saw themselves as Republicans and were remaining in the party and were criticizing Trump for his behavior, I mean, some of his policies as well, but it was more about who he is as a person. That's kind of over with. That if that's how you feel about Trump, you're really just not in the Republican Party anymore. Right. So now the only kind of resistance or disagreement that remains is a policy-based disagreement that never focuses on Trump himself, but is about, well, Trump should do this policy rather than this policy, which ironically has, in my view, allowed for more interesting policy disagreements and fights in the second Trump administration than there was in the first Trump administration, because the conflicts over him personally so overshadowed everything else. Now we're actually seeing people who want, a more immigration restrictionist policy versus a more, well, we got to make accommodations for high-skilled immigrations. Tariffs was another one, and now aspects of foreign policy. And I do think now we're getting to a place where I think the regime change conversation has been curtailed somewhat. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem to be as much on the table. Again, we'll get into more of that in a moment, but it seems like the argument, and also Thomas Massie is just making a constitutional argument that we should be taking votes on this. I don't see how anyone could reach a conclusion other than that this has to be voted on, particularly because holding people accountable for how they voted on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars has been an important part of our politics for the last 20 years. It is what allowed for, it certainly allowed for Barack Obama's victory over Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. You can make a case it allowed for Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. So to not be taking those votes just seems like a fundamental dereliction of duty to me.
Yeah, look, on the point of the vote, I think it would obviously be better if people were on the record for or against it. It is also just, I think, almost unarguably true that Trump should have sought such authorization, because when you look at the War Powers Act, it pretty clearly lays out scenarios like this. There are exceptions, none of which the current situation in Iran fulfills or meets. But to your point about debates within the Republican Party, it is interesting that there's this push and pull between the genuine policy differences that you have just outlined and Trump's willingness or desire to stamp his own will on the party once he has decided that he's going in a certain direction. And so I don't think it is healthy for the Republican Party, nor would it be healthy for any party, to have the leader of that party say, well, if you disagree with me, I'm going to fund a primary against you.
Yeah, the system is kind of, you're allowed to disagree until the decision is made, and then you're supposed to fall in line behind the president, which could be improved.
Not the wisest when it comes to war, certainly.
Yes. Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a perfectly adequate show for you today. Niall, there has been entirely too much collegiality, cordiality, agreement between us this week. So I wrote a radar you're definitely not going to like to get us off fighting finally.
Well, I like to think that we have some things that we can have a spirited disagreement about, and this sounds like it's going to be one of them. So why don't you tell us what's in your radar?
Well, Senator Bernie Sanders returned to the Joe Rogan Experience yesterday, and what an episode it was. Once upon a time, of course, Sanders was the preferred candidate of Joe Rogan. The podcasting giant gave the independent left Democrat his endorsement in 2020, endorsement that many mainstream liberals treated as a drawback at the time, which actually seems quite insane today. In fact, some members of the liberal media wanted Sanders to reject the Rogan endorsement and distance himself from Rogan due to Rogan's contrarian and independent-minded views on topics like the COVID pandemic, transgenderism, wokeness, and so on. Fast forward to 2025, and Democrats are desperate for their own liberal Joe Rogan, having now had to grapple with the fact that progressivism's knee-jerk rejection of every broadly popular figure who does not fit neatly into a box has left them friendless and at odds with the trajectory of American cultural life. So I'm not surprised that this time around there aren't any Democrats wagging their fingers at Bernie for going on Rogan. Could it be they'd like to learn from him? And look, I will say this, Sanders does maintain a certain appeal. He's still quite sharp. He was able to deftly converse with Rogan on a range of topics despite his advanced age. He's so much more cognitively capable than Joe Biden. It's frankly embarrassing that the Democratic Party didn't go with this option in 2020. That said, he made a number of arguments that, while perfectly well articulated and reasonable sounding, are, in my view, wrong. In fact, Rogan even called one of them out as Sanders was making it. Let's watch this early part of the interview, which focused on the power of billionaires to influence public policy with their dollars, something the progressive left is obsessed with. Here was Sanders attacking the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which he thinks is pretty much the worst thing that ever happened to our country and the source of all of our problems.
What it says is, you're a billionaire. You have now the constitutional right, because your money is your freedom of expression, right? So you don't like Bernie Sanders? You can put millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into a campaign and express your view about how terrible Bernie Sanders is,
Right.
and you can buy that election, right? That's your
Right.
constitutional right. I think that's probably the worst decision that the Supreme Court has ever made. So what is the result of that decision?
Let's set aside for the moment, but we'll come back to it. The obvious problem Sanders is complaining about: a Supreme Court decision that allows you to, well, use your free speech to criticize Bernie Sanders. To my mind, that's something that should obviously be permissible in a democracy. Here's the next part.
Elon Musk, and I know Elon was on your show, and he's here in Austin, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. And we could talk about Elon, but he spent $270 million to elect Trump as president. Okay. I think that's absurd that any one person.
What's the most someone donated towards the Harris campaign?
They spent a lot of money on Harris as
They
well.
spent $1.5 billion just
Combined.
over the course of a couple of months.
You got it. All right, let me talk about it. So
Yeah,
I'm not here
let's
just
talk
to say
about
it's
that.
a Republican. That's my point here.
Ding, ding, ding. Thank you, Joe Rogan, reminding viewers that it is not the case that one party received tons of money from wealthy people and the other does not. Both parties and their candidates are the recipients of huge sums of money. The reason for that is because the federal government has tremendous power to affect the bottom lines of wealthy people. That is why they spend so much. The feds get to decide whether to break Meta into a bunch of smaller companies. So, of course, Mark Zuckerberg is going to spend his money to stop that. The feds get to decide whether Amazon, the most efficient engine of meeting human need ever devised, gets hampered by costly regulation. You better believe Jeff Bezos is going to get involved in politics. It's true of Apple. It's true of Google. You bet it's true of Elon Musk. It's not just wealthy individuals, activist groups, teachers' unions spend millions of dollars to help elect Democrats because they think Democrats do a better job protecting their jobs, wages, and summer vacations. If you don't like how much money gets spent on politics, then the best solution, in my view, is to make politics matter less. If the government had less power, it wouldn't be worth spending so much to control it. But I want to go back to the first part of Sanders' answer and remind everybody watching, once again, that this is about not just money, but speech. Citizens United was a film company that made a documentary that was critical of then-candidate Hillary Clinton. The Federal Election Commission, the FEC, fined the filmmakers for daring to air TV advertisements for this film within 30 days of a primary election or 60 days from the general, which was contrary to the law. Think about that. The feds were saying they had the power to stop a filmmaker from buying ads to promote their documentary. Now, before the Supreme Court, attorneys for the FEC argued they could do the same to a book. In fact, they could stop you from publishing a book about a candidate who was too close to the election. That's what sold Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy, the court's swing voter at the time, that the law had to be struck down. Don't take my word for it. Here was Kennedy discussing the case years later.
The attorney for the government of the United States argued that if there was an upcoming political campaign, I forget maybe 6 weeks, and a book was being published or a movie being produced and it was critical of a candidate, that you could stop publication. I thought it was unbelievable. This is the First Amendment right.
Now, I appreciate why political figures, members of Congress, and perhaps Bernie Sanders himself wouldn't want you to be able to publish a critical documentary or a film or advertise it on television. But it should be obvious to Rogan and viewers who correctly prize free speech that such a law would have and did violate their First Amendment rights. If we want to limit how much, say, wealthy people have over government policy, well, then we have to set limits on government policy, not on wealthy people, because limits on people apply to my free speech rights too, and your free speech rights as well. That's my rebuttal to Bernie Sanders.
Oh, Robby. Oh, dear.
Tell me why I'm wrong, Niall.
We'll certainly get off to a disagreement here. Look, I could quibble with some of the characterizations there of the Citizens United, the organization, and Citizens United, the decision. But I think where we differ on this question is actually a larger question, because to me it seems completely obvious that if you permit corporations, which Citizens United did, to spend unlimited amounts of money backing one candidate or hampering another. You are effectively drowning out the free speech of people who do not have those means. And so Sanders was right to acknowledge that this is not a one-party equation. Yes, Elon Musk spent almost $300 million. That's a vast sum of money. But there are people on the Democratic side who spend that amount of money too. Let me, to try to put a point on this argument, use a hypothetical where the money would be spent with a position I agree with. I have argued here in favour of gun control numerous times. Michael Bloomberg basically agrees with me on that. Michael Bloomberg can then spend 10 or 50 or $100 million arguing that position. That has the effect of drowning out lots of individual gun owners, people of more modest means who think otherwise. So it's not just this argument about basic free speech. It's about people's voices being drowned out by the super wealthy.
But I mean, I appreciate you applying the argument to an issue where you would take the
rich guy's side.
You would take the rich guy's position. I guess I philosophically don't agree with that, or I don't think that's something to be addressed. I mean, you and I, as virtues of being television hosts, have a somewhat unequal ability to project our speech versus someone commenting in the YouTube comments on the show. Mm-hmm. That's just the nature of reality. I mean, the New York Times does endorsements for candidates. They did a quasi-endorsement of Cuomo over Mamdani using their free speech rights to do so. That has tremendous power and influence. It matters more than Joe Smith on the streets endorsement. It's an unequal use of speech, but it is just, I guess it's not to me an improper use of speech. The New York Times Corporation can use its speech to advocate for whatever public policy, to advocate for specific candidates. We all accept, I mean, maybe there's some right-wing people who think that should be not allowed, but generally speaking, we say, well, yeah, that's free speech. I don't see how it's different if the company is Burger King or Bloomberg or whatever, using their speech to advocate for the things they want. They have more influence to do it. Maybe that's lamentable. And then of course, we don't have time to get into this. I also probably disagree with you on how much impact that can actually have in terms of the actual motivating of voters. Obviously, just drawing attention to something helps. Elon Musk, what he probably did best for Trump was turn his social media site, his speech platform, into a much more pro-Trump organization. Was that, even if we had stricter campaign finance laws, how could you have a law that stops him from using the platform he owns? That's a very speech-focused thing, right?
Right, but I mean, that is obviously a speech platform.
I think these are hard to differentiate.
Well, I don't think they're that hard to differentiate, with all due respect, because I think when you're talking about spending money with the express purpose of electing a particular candidate in terms of advertising and so on and so forth,
But it's what you're spending
that
on.
is different from actual free speech rights and, as I say, overwhelms the free speech rights of people who do not.
I guess if you were like giving it to somebody to change that, like, I'm giving you $200, now you have to vote for whoever, maybe. But again, the thing you're buying with the money is a billboard or an advertisement, or it's a speech thing.
Right, but the fact that rich people or interests don't carry every election, as Andrew Cuomo just found out, which we'll talk about in a second.
Can't wait to talk about that.
That does not mean that money doesn't give you an advantage. And if that advantage is rendered limitless by a lack of campaign finance restrictions, I think that's a problem.
Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. What else? I am joined, of course, by Niall Stanich, my friend, and I don't know about you, but I am mentally already on vacation, yet physically I am here for another few hours at least.
Unlike you, I'm not about to go on vacation, but it is my last rising day of the week, so I have some inkling of how you might be feeling. But before we get to that, Robbie, what's on your radar?
Let's get to it. Well, Representative Thomas Massie has been in the news a lot lately for opposing U.S. involvement in Israel's war with Iran, believing that military action is something Congress needs to vote on, and for, in general, just being an American first patriot who sticks to his principles even when they conflict with what is politically expedient. This has put him in conflict with President Donald Trump recently, although I will note that Trump seems to have embraced diplomacy and peace rather than war and regime change as of late. He recently criticized both Israel and Iran for wanting conflict with each other, even dropping an F-bomb after literal bombs the U.S. dropped on Iran. Sounds like he's singing Massie's tune, frankly, even though he has vowed to fund a primary challenge to the libertarian-leaning Republican congressman from Kentucky. Now, Massie, for his part, seems to welcome the challenge and is not muting his criticism of U.S. interventionism and also of the big, beautiful bill. Like Republican Senator Rand Paul, Massie thinks the bill is a bloated, big government mess that adds trillions of dollars to the deficit. And in a recent interview with podcaster Theo, he got to the heart of the real problem with the bill, which is that it's the everything bagel of federal legislation. Since there's so much to it, members of Congress feel like they can't vote against it. They'll be crucified for voting against the good parts of it. Listen to this.
Get rid of the giant bills, okay? The omnibus bills, the continuing resolutions, and even the big, beautiful bill. Why not put that on the floor one at a time?
I agree.
And then that way, you can go to your representative or your senators and say, why did you vote for that? Right now, they can say, well, Theo, I had to vote for it. I had a pay raise for soldiers, right? They literally will put a pay raise for soldiers in every freaking bill.
Massie continues.
You vote against it. You have to go back home and watch TV ads that say he voted against a pay raise for the soldiers.
Right. Even though he may have voted for 90 other amazing things on the bill, right?
Right.
And that was one thing that was tied in there that if you went this way,
Yeah.
it may have been like oxygen for grandmothers, right?
Literally, there probably is that in there.
But if you vote for oxygen for grandmothers, then they're not going to give. So I see what you're saying.
That really is the problem in a nutshell, and it's killing Congress and, relatedly, killing our democracy. Congress is supposed to be a deliberative legislative body that considers potential policies, regulations, spending packages, and then votes on them. What a world. When it all gets rolled into one, you lose the ability to have a debate about the merits of any individual provision of the bill. For instance, conservatives are currently debating a policy proposed by Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah to sell off federal land for development. Now, some on the right support this because it would allow for more housing to be built, while others oppose it. But the point is this: when it was in the big, beautiful bill, almost nobody even knew about it. Now, the Senate parliamentarian has actually stripped it from the big, beautiful bill, stripped some other stuff as well, for reasons we don't need to get into right now. So it's actually getting some attention, the selling of land, discussion, and also debate on social media at least. But it's not being debated by Congress. I can tell you that. The everything bagel mode of governance has, unfortunately, paralyzed our democracy and the efficiency of our government. It also leads to endless growth of government, a real failure to constrain the deficit. I've said it a lot this week, so I'll say it one more time. It would be great for MAGA, great for America first, great for the entire country if members of Congress took their jobs a little bit more seriously, at least as seriously as Thomas Massie and Theo Vaughn.
Interesting one, Robby. I know that you're a big fan of the congressman, who is, I think, in the House at least, the closest aligned to your libertarian principles. I take in the abstract the point that it would be better to have any provision that is to be voted on by the Congress sort of separated out. I think that would avoid the kind of concept that he's talking about, where you have to vote for a thing you don't like, otherwise you'll get negative ads about some other thing that everyone would agree to that you've then voted against. My question about it really is one more of practicality, because it seems to me that the problem right now is not that Congress is like passing too many laws or it's working at such breakneck speed. It's exactly the opposite, that Congress is seizing up quite a lot of the time. And if you then, even with good intentions, just vastly multiply the number of bills, I just imagine that sort of sclerotic slowness will get even worse.
Well, maybe, but they're voting on things that they don't even know what's in the bills. The bills are these, omnibus bills that are so long, so many pages, that get passed at the last moment when the whole government's about to shut down. They don't even know what they're voting for. I mean, it's just an insane way to do government at all. I mean, that no other country is like this. At the last minute, has to cram through some piece of legislation they don't even understand. Yeah. It's so sad how broken it is. This whole land issue, which is heating up on the right. I don't know how familiar you are with it. I've become more aware of it in the last week, because it is somewhat unpopular with many conservatives. I'm actually in mild support of it, although in some ways I don't think it goes far enough. it's an interesting one. This idea Mike Lee has, so much of the land, in the West is actually owned by the federal government. In Nevada, in Utah, Nevada it's like 80 or 90% of the whole state. Utah's like 60% of the whole state. And we don't want to sell up the national parks. Are going to remain the national parks. It doesn't include the national parks. It doesn't include land that can't be used for housing. There's so many veto points in the selling off. It's got to be approved by the community. It's got to be approved by the Secretary of the Interior. It's got to be, if the Chinese tried to buy the land, Trump could veto it. There's all different ways in which it's the most mild proposal of all time to create some more housing. And now we're debating it on social media. It was in this bill, and it had gotten no attention because it was just in a gazillion-page bill.
Yep.
The policy should obviously be voted on by itself, and now maybe it's going to, because the Senate parliamentarian, which is kind of a weird thing anyway, that this person, unelected, gets to decide, which Ryan Grimm used to, when he and I hosted Rising together years ago, he would complain to the end of time
anti-Senate parliamentarian.
He hated the Senate parliamentarian. It was thwarting at the time the what was the other BBB bill? The Build Back Better.
Build Back Better, the Biden infrastructure, the massive Biden bill together. Yes. Yeah, I mean the Mike Lee thing. This proves your point in a way. I have not been following that debate particularly closely, but also Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I believe we're going to have on later today in Rising. She, correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't she said that she would not have voted to support this bill had she known that the AI regulations or ban on state-level regulations were in it?
She might have. I have no idea what the view is on that.
But she certainly, I think, took the view that something that she was unhappy with relating to AI was in it at the time that she voted for it, and she didn't notice because it goes on forever. So
right. People who want to ram through unpopular pieces of legislation want it to be an everything bagel bill, so they don't look too closely at the details. Or, it's going to do something you don't like. Oh, well, but it's part of the spending package that keeps the government operating, so we gotta pass it. Don't look too closely at those details. It just seems so obviously bad. I mean, no one is really defending this way of doing things. It's just the default given the political constraints we have.
Well, and also, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because sometimes in government, you have to do things that aren't going to be particularly popular.
Sure.
And naturally enough, elected officials of either party are going to want some sweetener or some way to defend that. So what is, normal or potentially useful kind of horse trading, and what is very devious, let's just slip this in the bill and not say anything about it.
It's a really interesting interview, the rest of the interview Massie did with Theo Vaughn, by the way. Massie is a fascinating individual. His house, his property was like all built by him and is totally environmentally and energy-wise self-sufficient. And he talks a lot about that. It's interesting stuff. The guy lives off the grid. It's very interesting.